Hello, and help me welcome L'Oreal Tolano, an activist from Nashua. Lori, welcome to People's View.
Thank you for
Hey,
having me. It's a
tell us a
pleasure to
little
come.
bit about your involvement with the Board of Assessment.
Well, I started almost a year ago to the day. It was the end of August that new reevaluation numbers came out. And my husband and I started looking at the data, saw a lot of inconsistencies just in our neighborhood. We weren't overly happy with the assessment we had, felt when we moved in that it was too high, 4 years earlier. Didn't really have a way or figure out how to deal with that, and speaking with the office. And then once we got all the data released by KRT, when they did the reevaluation, we could see a lot of the discrepancies in the neighborhoods regarding this assessment model. And it sort of blossomed from there. The administration had dug in pretty firm that this model and these values were spot on. The model met the statistical deviations and the requirements of the state, and everything was perfect. But if you've ever done modeling or understand modeling, it's a predictive tool.
Yeah,
and models behave well some of the time, but not all of the time.
right.
And it's only good, the model is only as good as the data you're inputting. And so if you let your data quality fall, which I believe was happening in the assessing office with how we were maintaining our records, then the integrity of the model becomes questionable.
So it's it was something where they're not doing the record keeping properly, or the processes
Yes.
Of assessing was
Yes.
off too, or
Yes.
varied too much?
Varied a lot. There were, the administration pushed forward after a few months, 3 months of public complaint. They conducted a management audit, and they concluded by March that they were removing the chief of assessing. The scary part was they were eliminating the management position. That was tough. I supported the change in the position, but not the elimination of the position. The assessing office desperately needs a very qualified chief and a good manager, a good technical person, a working manager. So, and what happened is it fell into disarray over the last, I would say, 5 years, where they didn't have a lot of procedure or policy. The ones they had were not being followed. The data records weren't being uniformly upgraded. The capturing of sales data was being missed randomly. The valuation of permits was questionable, and in some instances not captured at all. And all of these factors lead to disproportionate assessments. And so KRT comes in and they assume that the city has captured all permits, has adjusted all properties that have sold in between a reevaluation cycle, that they've maintained the records appropriately, and all the data is uniform. And that just wasn't the case. And so when they scoop up that information and they start building a model off of it, it's a problem. Plus, we just found out in the last week, actually going up to the hearing and rereading the contract, KRT was supposed to validate all the sales data used for the model. They didn't do that part. They were told by the city, and we don't know who, that they didn't have to. It was done. The problem is it was a written part of the contract, and no one ever amended the contract or signed off on it to take those terms out. And it was a significant part of the work done and the cost of this $500,000 contract. And it appears not to have been done.
Oh, boy.
Yeah.
So they don't know what the source of the data was. They
Right.
just got it, and it just appeared on their desk.
Right. They took it. They assumed that these sales reviews were done by the office, that, every attempt to do an internal inspection, knock on the door, verify how the sale was conducted, if it was an arm's length transaction, that all of these things were done, but in fact it appears that they really were not done. And so, and when I went up to the hearing with the Board of Tax and Land Appeal, the state picked up on that. the Department of Revenue started looking at some of these records and picked up on the fact that the qualifications of the sales data was not really done.
So, I mean, they could have taken Friday's newspaper and wrote those numbers down? Is that what it is?
Well, it's not quite that simple, but when they see a sale in Friday's
Yeah.
newspaper, what they're supposed to do is they have MLS pictures they can
Right.
use, some instances they don't, and they don't have the complete house. When you're building a model that you're going to use to mass appraise a whole city, you want to take every opportunity to verify that data. And first and foremost, you'd like to get to the home, knock on the door, and ask if you could look and see the house. Now, they can deny entry, but a lot of times on a first-time sales home that's already been
Yeah.
adjusted,
Yeah.
they'll let entry. We welcomed entry when we first came in, and we questioned our value. We called the assessor and said, "Come over. We want you to look at the house." So there doesn't appear to have been a lot of effort to do that, and so it just calls to question how the model was constructed.
Well, there were a lot of people that looked for abatements
Yes.
on that. Was it unusual?
It was a high number. It was close to 400, which was a higher number. I don't know if you can really say how it falls out in other years, but it was a reevaluation year, and this reevaluation was different from the last two because the last two done in 2009 and 2013 were reductions to property values
right.
because of the recession. So you haven't seen this reevaluation with a big adjustment up in a long time in Nashua. So personally, I feel the number of abatements that came in was neither low nor high. It was what it was, and there was, because it was a big adjustment year on the upside. So people would definitely be more likely to contest it,
Sure.
and that's what happened.
Were there people that got denied that didn't think they should be denied? I mean, it was a big
Yes,
number.
yes, there were. One of the confusing parts of of that process was the city could not handle all the abatements. So they contracted 50 of the residential abatements back out to KRT that did the reassessment. Those ended up, in my opinion, being handled very poorly. So the city took a couple hundred residential abatements and they applied a typical market analysis process, I would say typical, where sales data and sales comparisons are used for your home.
Right.
So if you're trying to figure out the value of your home, you're looking at properties around you that might have sold in your neighborhood to see if you're in line. And that's a easier way for a taxpayer or property owner to understand their value. KRT took 50 of the abatements and did not use sales data. They just stood behind the model they created, and they said, we have a computer-aided mass appraisal model we made with 673 data points, and it was, tweaked and massaged and came out with all the correct statistical deviations, and your number is this, and there's really no debating it. It is what it is. And so the people that got put into the KRT pile ended up with a very different process that I strongly objected to. I don't think the Board of Assessors should have allowed two different processes
Right.
to be used in the city. That creates inequity.
That's right.
And they did. Remarkably, they did.
What's the State Board of Assessment think of that?
I brought that up when I was up there on Tuesday. I know I'm going to be filing up at the Board of Tax and Land Appeal on our property. We received a reduction, but not the reduction we thought we should. And so we're taking it a step further. We're trying to negotiate with the city, but they're not overly receptive. So, and I'm not certain they're really have been willing to negotiate with other people who've raised concerns. The other thing is, I made a big issue about what's called the equalization ratio. Every year the state takes our sales data and they calculate what how the properties are equalized. Ideally, when you do a reevaluation, everything should be at 1. But as the markets rise or fall, that ratio changes. Because the new sold properties will be at one level, but all the other properties are sitting at another. So as the market rises, this ratio falls. So after KRT came in, Our ratio last year went to 94.8 instead of 1. So anyone who won an abatement through the city based on a sales analysis, they looked at sold properties against your home and they said, oh yeah, your house should be 300,000, it should be 250. They would then multiply that sales number by the ratio, the 94.8, and that would be your new assessment. That's how it's done. But KRT, because they didn't really allow sales data to be used, their 50 properties did not get that number applied. None of them did. Anyone who they saw the need to change a property value, they did it based on looking at the house and saying, I'll rate the kitchen good. They made little physical characteristic changes, never looked at the sales data, and therefore never applied a ratio. So if you got into the KRT bucket, you could not get your assessment down based on a ratio. Only the city people could. It was not well done. It was not fair, and there'll be some people going up to the Board of Tax and Land Appeal on the issue to have them look at it.
Well, have they found places where people have changed the house somehow? And how do they figure out the additions that went on? Are they supposed to be told when they put on? Or
Yes.
what if somebody puts a pool in?
Well, that's a good, something. The permitting process through the building department is a very regulated process. And it works successfully if everyone is willing to follow the rules. And so contractors are your first, line.
Right.
They have to get over there if they're signing contracts with people to do home additions or whatever, get the proper permits pulled. And every contractor knows that. There's a certain fee associated with it. I don't think it's outrageous. It's really, in my opinion, pretty nominal. But there are some contractors that don't go get the permits. So
Now, what if the owner does the building? And,
if the owner's doing it, then the owner needs to go over to the building department and pull those permits.
'cause I know a lot of people just don't bother.
Don't
with
do it. Right. So you've got an issue with permits not being pulled, which is why being able to go into homes and evaluate them, it would be the best way to have equity. But the state has ruled against that. We have a no entry law in the state, and we have, as of, I believe, 6 years ago, they changed it such that if you deny entry, you still have the right to appeal your assessment. So prior to that, if you denied entry, you couldn't appeal.
I
So
see.
if you said you can't come in and they gave you a high assessment, you were stuck with it. But the courts ruled, I think in around 2012, if you don't let them in and your assessment's high, you can still file an abatement. So you do have an avenue. But what happens when you file an abatement, you have to let them in at that point.
Yeah.
At that point, you really got to let them in to
Sure.
say, okay, we'll back what you're saying because we can see it too. So you can only hide so long. However, the concept of doing a listed measure, which means we're going to go to every door, knock on it, and get in, I think is pretty obsolete now, because the bulk of the people don't open their door. And with the Nashua Assessing Office the way it is right now, with the internal chaos going on in there and the lack of structure, I wouldn't tell anyone to open their door.
Yeah.
It's not, you're not
Well,
going
I
to
can see the reason for that. They're not operating properly. But if they were operating properly, wouldn't they have just a sampling?
That's the problem. And now the sampling is small. You're talking like maybe 15%. So when you're only getting into 15% of the homes, is that telling you what equity is throughout the whole city?
Right.
I don't think so. And my observation of that, talking to other chiefs and management people in assessing, is that the homes they're getting into, by and large, the people who open their door are the ones with the really old homes that are falling apart. One assessor said to me, I never go in and see a new kitchen or a finished basement. That's not the kind of house I'm walking into. Nobody opens their door for that because they don't want to pay for it if it's not caught on the card. But so even if your sampling is not random, which it sounds like it is not, then you can't hang your hat on a listed measure creating equity in and of itself. I think the state is still holding on to the concept that you should do it, and I think the reason they're doing it is their position is some data's better than none,
Yeah.
but it's a very expensive endeavor. You know, for us, we're going to talk about spending $2.5 or $3 million. The bond that they brought forward to the board on Tuesday was for $1.3 million. It was way too low. When they go out for proposals, that's not even going to be close. And if they want to run a real campaign to get people to open their doors and go back over and over again, which I don't think they're going to be successful at, and spend the money doing that, you're gonna spend $2.5 million.
Gee, the mayor can't use that $5 million extra that he found.
No, that's right. And so, you know, I look at that and I really feel like the list and measure technique is obsolete now because the state laws have made it so.
Yeah.
What I'd like to see happen, when you abate right now, any person who wants to abate their value, the city makes them use sales properties. You look around at what's sold within the last year of the year you're abating, and you see what those sales prices are relative to yours. I would like to see the state allow and the Department of Revenue allow property owners to use neighborhood values, not just sales values, but the neighborhood you're in, especially on a reevaluation year.
Yeah.
If you're reevaluating and you're telling everyone is equalized, the ratio is 1, your whole street's been equalized. I mean, everyone is spot on. The model's perfect, right? It's good. Then I want to be able to look at my neighbor's house that's just like mine
Yeah.
and say, I should be at their assessment. I'm 150,000 higher. I want to be at that one. And they'll say, no, that didn't sell in the last year, so you can't use it. And to me, they have to change some of that. Now, it's really interesting because I talked to some chiefs when I was up at the hearing, and I explained how difficult it is to deal with this abating process when you can only use sales data, especially if you're in an old neighborhood with unique properties. And that chief was stunned. He said to me, what do you mean you can only use sales data? He said, of course you can use neighborhood data. You should look at your neighborhood. If your neighbors are 100,000 less than you, the city should be fixing that.
Yeah.
He was shocked that this city does not correct on that kind of missed data. And they don't here in Nashua.
It's easy to go through the numbers.
You cannot argue in this city. I've tried it. I helped people with abatements where I showed houses that weren't sold but were beautifully done, comparable properties, really great comparisons that are, the assessments are off by 100 to 125,000.
Wow.
And the person who's sitting at the high end of the pile, they will not take down. They will not adjust them. So it's frustrating.
It was, I had an experience back in 2003. The house I moved into, I found out, I thought it was a little high when I looked at it compared to the neighbors. They said, well, you have a finished basement. Well, part of it's finished. They didn't have the right dimensions, and I just filed a piece of paper with the dimensions, and they corrected it.
Yes. When it's really simple like that, usually you can do okay. If you can find an error that's a flaw in the dimensions or the finish of a space, that's usually very correctable. But if you're trying to look
They
at...
didn't even come out or look or anything.
They didn't, huh? No, they should have. But actually, by policy, I'll tell you, Carl, they should have been there. So
I don't live in that house anymore.
They should have come and taken a look. But that's sort of the rules. But that's the issue.
So you're saying basically they really got to go strip down the thing, start over again, and write it the right way.
They
write
really
the policies.
have to get everyone on the same page in the office. You have assessors right now, even the same assessor will go and look at sales data, see a house that's lovely, see bathrooms that are beautifully tiled and multi-fixture, and you'll look on the property card and they rated it average. Okay, they'll say that's an average bathroom. They'll go to another property that has a bathroom very similar, and on the property card it says excellent. And I've brought this to the administration, and I've said, what's the difference?
Yeah.
What's your criteria? I really raised a stink about that last November, and at that point the chief was still there, and he said to me that he was willing to generate a policy, write something, to help create a standard when they look at fixturing in a house. You know, if a kitchen has a granite or a marble countertop or a unique feature, we're going to value it. You know, it has value. I am still waiting for that policy. It'll be a year in November.
They don't like to write policy.
They don't, and they struggle with it. They don't do it publicly. There's no policy workshops where the public could hear, listen, or give input. It's all behind doors. They just wrote a policy and assessing. They've managed to get one done that I know of, which is if somebody buys a home and the assessors change the assessment, they said by $20,000, they will mail them a letter. Now, in the past, much to my surprise, and it happened to us buying a home, they have a department that's in disarray. There are sales adjusting properties that sold. Some people are buying homes where the assessors' permits were pulled and the assessors missed all the permits. So the house sells, the new couple comes in, their taxes, they think the permits were closed, the work was done years ago. And all of a sudden their tax bill goes up like $3,000. That's a big change.
Wow.
And they don't send a letter home to the taxpayer. What's happened, some of these younger people, December, it's their banks calling them saying, your escrow account is empty and we can't cover your tax bill. And their hair lights on fire and they're like, what do you mean? And then they learn that their assessment was changed $2,000 or $3,000. The city wasn't telling people. That flabbergasted me.
Oh, yeah.
So now they wrote a policy, but I don't like the way they wrote it. They wrote it to say, if an assessment goes up $20,000, we'll send a letter. Well, $20,000 is an arbitrary number, and to me it should be a percentage of the value.
Yeah.
Somebody who lives in a $200,000 home, $20,000 is 10%.
Right.
Somebody who lives in a $600,000 home,
Yeah.
$20,000 is 3%. You know, you're actually punishing those with less income
Right.
with a fixed number.
Right.
So I've said to them, don't do it on it. But I only learned that they had set it up that way because I went to the office and I asked to see the manual, which they did not want to give to me. Had to literally fight for it. Got the manual, started looking through it, and I saw that the policy was, quote, written. It had never been discussed in a public meeting. It had never been approved by the Board of Assessors. There was never any opportunity for the public to say anything. All that.
Do the aldermen get involved in those things? They're the ones that are supposed to pass policy.
Well, they have a Board of Assessors, and I think the Board of Assessors has the right to work. Their mission is to review policy and ensure compliance to meet
Right.
the state standards
Right.
and local legislation.
Right.
That's actually their mission. So if that's their mission statement, why aren't they looking at policy?
Yeah.
The very thing they're doing, they're not looking at. So the whole governmental process is questionable. They're not working as a body that is serving the taxpayer or the people. They're working too hard to service an administration.
Well, you know, it's almost like these are my friends. We'll just do it the way we think it should be done, and usually that's just the easiest way.
Yes.
And that doesn't cause more work. It doesn't have you go check something or
They
whatever.
don't want more work, that's for
Right.
sure. It comes across as an underlying laziness to not want to roll up your sleeves and deal with some of this stuff. And-
Unfortunately, I've seen enough of that at the state too.
yes, and it's not, it doesn't work for the greater good at all. And so I think a lot of our elected officials have missed the point of their calling, that they're there to serve the public and they're in a seat to build public trust, and it's not a personal power seat to serve an administration. They need to serve the community, and they've lost touch with that.
Yeah, I think so. And I think the other point you made about it really winds up hurting the people who can't afford it.
Oh, and this issue for assessing all the young people coming in that are a debt-burdened group of people right now in this country. Senior citizens, it hurts. The entry-level real estate market right now is so hoppin' hot
Yeah.
that it's seeing the highest jump in values. So for people buying first-time homes, they're being affected greatly.
yeah.
So that tax equity or that assessment equity is very important for them.
Sure.
And it's such a complex issue. I feel badly that it's so complex because the burden of proof for your assessment is on the homeowner, and getting access to the information to defend yourself and understanding the process is really difficult. I think a lot of people are lost as to how to defend their values. They just don't know,
Yeah,
you know. And if they think it's wrong, they don't know how to fight it.
I know. I think that's, we were always talking up at the state of having a ombudsman who was there for the person, the resident, and on whatever, whether it was a business or a house or school or whatever.
Right.
So because it's complex in the way you should go to these places to get corrections.
Right.
It's really hard.
Right. I think so. Yeah.
I don't know what we're going to do with that, but we ought to have people like you keep reminding our elected officials that
Right.
they have a job to do.
Exactly.
And they should be happy to do it if they're running. They should work on it.
Right, right. I'm hoping that we can create more of a public-oriented practice. I mean, we're pushing the public away too
Right.
much,
Right.
and we need to allow this public input and allow this oversight from the public, and welcome it. Don't be fearful of it and run from it, and I think you'll end up with a better-run city,
I agree.
better-run government.
Yeah, it'll run smoother and you'll have happy people there.
You'll have educated people, is what it is.
Yeah.
When everyone's more educated,
Yeah.
we're all forced to think more. And the people who challenge you the most, if you're willing to accept that gladly, you're going to become a smarter person. And instead of running from that, allow yourself to grow
Right.
with the challenge.
Yeah.
And they're not letting that happen, which is a little bit disappointing.
Well, thank you for all your input. And,
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
when we find out how this thing works out and see how they're going to implement this new reassessment as over the next 3 years,
Yes.
we'll see if you've been as effective as you hope you.
Thank you very much.
Well, thank you again.
Yeah.